Hi, Jennifer. Welcome to this session of Caffeine and Carrots. We are very honored and very happy to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And for all the participants and followers of Caffeine and Carrots, it's a great pleasure to introduce Jennifer to you. I'm sure most of you know her already. She heads customer success at Seso right now. And Jennifer, I saw you underwent a recent Series A, so congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you.
Jennifer is also an author of a very popular book called The Startup's Guide to Customer Success. If you haven't heard about it or read it, please go ahead. I think we all have gone through it, and there's great value in what she says. Very practical, Jennifer. So, congratulations on a great career so far.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot.
Uh, as the community is aware, I think Jennifer has created a niche for herself in the startup and CS overlap, right? And it's an important discussion that we have been having across different elements of the community, Jennifer, that when is the right time to do CS? Is it after a certain maturity of the organization, a certain set of customers you have, a certain revenue you hit? What is it? And we have all have our own opinions around it. So for yourself, what would be your answer to this question? And how do you define a startup actually?
Yeah, so many great questions there. So I think first and foremost, CS is a mindset, in my opinion. So it's not just a function. It's not like doing QBRs. It's not just all that. It's all this mindset about where does the voice of the customer live and how are they represented throughout the organization. So in that, with that said, my kind of philosophy is that customer success should really start on day zero, even with the
Mhm,
CEO. The
mhm.
CEO is in some sense the first CSM at the company, even though he
Yeah,
doesn't, or he or she doesn't necessarily have that title.
yeah,
He or she is probably the person going out, getting to know the customer, really understanding what are their pain points, what are their goals, what are their success metrics, whatever it is.
yeah.
They're trying to find a product market fit, and that's very similar to what a lot of CSMs do, and
Right.
CS in general. So that's kind of how I see it in terms of looking at, when do you actually start hiring someone for customer success, dedicated to customer success? Of course, it depends by each startup. So, for example, if your product is super, super complex, I talk about this in my book, the difference between product complexity and user complexity and how it interacts. So
Yeah,
if your product is super complex, it requires, a million steps in order to implement. But once you implement, it's super powerful. Then maybe you want to look into someone, leading customer success more early on versus something where, you click a button, everything like, you know,
yeah.
my dog could do it sort of thing.
Right, right.
That I think for, when it comes to starting customer success more formally, that's kind of what you look at first. And in terms of like startups, I know there is so many different definitions of startups from, pre-IPO or pre-exit to, under 100 people or whatever that is. But at the end of
Right,
the day, it really comes to, team maturity. So
right,
not only the whole team's maturity and the product maturity, but also like the customer success team's maturity. I think later on in this, we'll talk a little bit more about like tech stack and CS operations. Well, if you're a team of one in customer success, even if the rest of your company is 100 people,
yeah,
I really hope
right,
that's not the case. But then your team is, the customer success team is not mature enough to, get those huge, huge things just yet. So it really depends on that team maturity. So I typically look at when startups are, full team around 200 to 100. So that's typically Series A, Series B, because that's usually when you're getting your
right,
feet wet, getting your motions in place, so to speak.
right,
And then customer success teams can usually range between one person to even 20 people.
right, right. No, wonderful. And on the startup discussion. So, just a little while back, I was actually part of another webinar, and there was a good question thrown at us. And the question was, and I think you'll like it as well. The question was, as a CSM member of a startup, trying to get to a product market fit, how do you balance out between an ideal customer and a non-ideal customer. Because
Mm.
in that phase you get both typically
Oh,
because you
oh boy, do you get both. And I think this is where I would challenge that person to think about what is the ideal and how do you know already so early on,
yeah,
right? Like while you're still finding product market fit, you probably have a preconceived notion of what that ideal customer is, but you
right,
actually don't know. Like maybe you have the wrong stakeholder, maybe you have the wrong champion, maybe, you know, that person just, you know, you got that one person that's actually ideal but like just doesn't understand it for whatever reason. And I think kind of keeping that open mind when it comes to customer success and your ideal customer is, you know, really important, because, you know, it could be that you have two different types of customers, or there's two different types of strategies and CS motions that you want to run. Like one, maybe one, you know, for example, at my company, we deal, you know, I'm in agriculture. And so we deal with very, very big farms, so also very, very
yeah,
small farms. And then
yeah,
so for these very, very small farms, like and for me, they're all ideal because very, very small farms, I'm typically working with the owner. The owner is, you
yeah,
know, super, super busy, has 20 million things going on. But this is my product is very core, but I need to make sure that I understand where they're coming from, that I am one of many. And, you know, I'm helping to streamline their process, and they kind of, you know, want to keep going with their lives, and they want to make sure that their crops are okay and all that good stuff. Whereas if I'm working with a huge, huge, huge farm, typically I'm working with like a dedicated staff member to my product or to the
right,
process that I help them run. And that's a
right,
very different you know, customer success conversation. And both of these are actually super important to our business. And so I recognize that it's not like, oh no, this is too small or this is too big. It's actually understanding and keeping an open mind of, you know, these can both be ideal customers. How do I, as a CS leader and as one of the first customer success people at the company, how do I craft a customer success strategy that,
right,
you know, really encompasses both of these and, you know, helps me get the voice of the customer back into the
right.
company. And also internally, how do I help communicate to every single department within my company the differences between these two customers and what they need, and, you know, how we want to strategize around them and how that can
Right.
inform sales, marketing, etc.
Right. No, wonderful, wonderful. Uh, let me also ask you this. It's very intriguing, and I think it's good for the community to also hear from you there. So, and in your own experience, now that your own organization has just gone through a Series A, what do you think see changing in CS operations there in the company? Is it going to remain the same pre-Series A and post-Series A? According to you, what's going to be the difference?
So yeah, pre-series A, it's just me. I was just the one lone CSM. Obviously, you know, the CS hat was worn by a lot of different people since I was pretty new to the company. But now we're already a team of 3, and we hope to be a team of 7 by the end, like
Yeah,
in a couple of months, which
yeah,
means, as anyone can expect, we'll need those CS operations, the CS technology, because there's, you know,
right.
really two different ways
You
to
can't
scale. And I
scale.
think that
Yeah,
exactly. And I think the two ways, and I think they should be, you should do both, but it just depends on how you weight them, is using
yeah,
technology as well as hiring. So I think
correct.
hiring, pretty straightforward. You know, you just have a ton of customers coming in. We just need help, or we need that certain type of expertise, or however else you need to balance a team, you know,
Right.
typical people management strategy sort of thing. And in terms of CS technology, like that's where you can really unlock efficiency. Like how can you get the CSM to account ratios even better?
Yeah.
Not only for, you know, metrics and stuff like that to investors, but also just for ourselves. Like I don't want to be
Yeah.
spent like as a CSM or as a manager, I don't want my team to be spending their whole day on one account.
Correct.
If they're not an enterprise CSM, like I would want to make sure that that makes sense in terms of efficiency and like really unlocking the technology behind that, whether that is how can I put the best metrics in front of them? How do I help, you know, maybe a little bit more junior CSMs really
Yeah.
understand the CS motions and how to know when to do things when and what to look out for, and, you know, really build those habits within them. And then also, how do I document all my processes, especially as things are going to
Yeah.
continue to grow and scale, not only
Yeah.
within the CS team, but also everywhere else. Because, you know, when you hit a series A, series B, it's not just, you know, you're adding more people, it's actually you're adding a lot more products, you're pushing out so many more um, features and channels
Yeah.
and different
Yeah.
marketing strategies. And how do you keep track of that, that's where the CS tech stack is just so important. And of course, if you need to hire a CS operations person, start that team up. That's also really exciting, especially when you have a lot going on in your tech stack, or just a lot of things are changing, or just, we just need another person to help organize all of this.
No, absolutely. And I think what you're saying is there's a definite move towards scaling it. You obviously have money, you have to use the money to scale. and CS operations and CS itself is no different. So you have to scale it. So you need some amount of technology help. You need to scale the team, knowledge retention, more structure. You could probably get away with doing ad hoc stuff and doing a relationship driven sort of account management and CS operations prior to Series A. Now that you have to scale it, you need more processes. So whether you like it or not, there has to be some bare minimum processes coming in. Wonderful. One question there, and this is something I think there's no right answer to it, but good to hear your thoughts, Jennifer. CS team members, you mentioned, hiring and scaling. So there are team members who are fit for larger organizations, very structured processes, a very defined way of working, less creativity, but very, very well-oiled engine. And then there are more of these smaller organizations, the startups, the mid-sized organizations, where there is a lot more activity, a lot more innovation and creativity, and you have more leeway and less on the process side. For you, what are the traits you will look at for just having undergone a Series A? What are the traits of the first few CS team members you hire? What are some few traits you will look at?
I mean, what a great question, because this is actually one of my mistakes early on in my CS career, was hiring, for, what I think would be the best person, but it was actually for, when we were huge, not for when I needed her right now. And I think Andreessen Horowitz actually has this theory, idea called like the Renaissance, and they use it for sales, but I think it's very applicable here for CS as well, as like the Renaissance salesperson. So you can see it like a Renaissance CSM, and I think that is exactly what you need for early stage. Your first, 4 or 5 CSMs should all be what we call Renaissance. And what does that mean? Kind of to break it down, it's like you want someone who's a little bit more jack of all trades, but really hustling, really gritty, really trying to think outside the box, and doesn't feel stuck in processes. And if anything, if they're excited by a lack of process, they like looking to the bits, being like, wow, there's nothing here, let's go. Like that energizes them. Right. And that can be hard to, look for. So sometimes one of the tricks, or not tricks, but something that I adopted in my interview process is actually giving them feedback up front during the interview. Like obviously not during the first phone screen, but maybe later on, and just see like, hey, great case study. Like I actually think there's 2 things I want you to work on, or I have 2 things I think could be something that you can improve on, and just see how they take it. Because if that doesn't excite them, like to keep growing and keep pushing, and if they're like, oh, you're giving me feedback, I'm always an A player, I don't know why you're like doubting me. Like you really want to suss out like what how they deal with ambiguity, how they deal with really quick cycles of feedback, all this stuff, because that's what you need for a Series A. And the people who are really good with processes and well-oiled machines and stuff like that, hey, you're gonna get them eventually. As you go, late Series B, Series C, Series D, oh yeah, they'll be in the organization for sure, and that's going to be super, super exciting. But when you're still small, your CS team's less than 5-10 people, you really need everyone to be pulling their weight, helping you strategize, helping you, really figure out what is the best, and not feeling like, okay, kickoff call, and let me ask these 5 questions and call it a day. It's like, no, let me. Exactly. Like you really need someone to go dig deep, and really like break things and understand how customers actually work. And I can go on and on, but you really need to find someone who
you need the drive. And what I'm hearing from you, and I couldn't agree more, Jennifer, by the way, that you need a little bit more of a solutioning mindset also, that you go hunting, ask a lot more whys than just the process allows you to. So you'll have to tick mark the 5 things on the kickoff call for sure. but also get into the next layer of probably detail so that you can help the customer at that stage. Wonderful. I think great insights from you. Moving on a little bit to technology now. So obviously scale mirrors the technology adoption curve also. How does a startup go about choosing what tools and what sort of stack they need? And it's a tough one. There is again no right answer, but according to you, what should be the thought process ideally?
Yeah. So for me, it's really understanding as a startup, you don't have a lot of time. So really understand what the technology you want the technology to do for you, right? Are you looking for a CRM? Are you looking for a data visualization tool? Are you looking for an email automation tool? Like
Right.
whatever it is, like be very, very clear in what you want.
Yeah.
And the reason why is that so when you start looking, you're not distracted by all the bells and whistles because
Yeah.
you really need to focus on what do you need to unlock the efficiencies within your CSM and not, what looks cool or what
Yeah.
exactly do you need? It's like, no, what do I actually need my team to do? So for
Yeah.
example, I might need a data visualization tool. Where does that currently live? How am I
Yeah.
currently doing that? How am I using it? And what are some of the use cases in which I
Right.
would use this data visualization tool or whatever
Right.
the need is? And then
Yeah.
with that, then go out into the market and really make sure that it really
Yeah.
fulfills those buckets
Yeah.
before you even buy. I think
Yeah.
you can get in a cycle of getting too many tech stuff at once,
Yeah.
and then it actually becomes more of an issue, kind of like hiring and people. So
Yeah.
be really, really thoughtful in every single one that you're bringing in. How do they integrate together, etc. And also, like I think separately, like don't be scared of tech. I think
Yeah.
sometimes I've run into startups who are even though we're all mostly tech, who are a little bit worried about like, oh well, what if I get this, like will it defocus my time? And that's where it all comes back to like being super super clear in what you want a tech
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
text thing to do for you.
Yeah.
And if you have that'll help kind of alleviate a lot of those
Yeah.
anxieties and kind of what you're looking for.
Right. Right. No,
Yeah.
you're right. And I think with CS tech stack, the nuance is that because it holds a function together, so it aggregates a lot of stuff and operates a lot of stuff together. So I think it does warrant, it is a strategic buy even for a startup, because
Yeah.
it's not, like you said, it's not a bolt-on tool which will operate on its own. You do need to invest some time to be able to actually leveraging a full-blown CS tech like ourselves, for example. But you're right. So I think it's horses for courses, and you should be very. We love a customer in the sales cycle who's very clear about the use case. This is what we want to use it for. I want to
Yeah.
improve my onboarding experience, or I want to improve my this particular metric, and that's my primary use case. We love a customer like that because then it becomes much easier to show the value prop from a sales standpoint, from an org standpoint, and obviously implement accordingly as well. Vis-a-vis,
For
we
sure.
don't know what we want, we just want a tool. Becomes slightly,
Oh,
honestly, a little bit more difficult. Yeah.
and I also think in terms of implementation, just from the other side, when you're implementing a tool and you don't know why you're implementing it, or you don't have a very clear use case, then it becomes much harder to implement. Like, yeah, you might feel like, oh, I want a data viz tool or I want a CRM, and you find that in SmartKarrot, which is great.
Yeah.
But if you don't know exactly how you're going to be using, like, are you
Yeah.
going to focus on
Right.
onboarding? Going to focus on what? Then when you're creating your dashboard, like what metrics to put on there and what
Right.
playbooks you want to highlight, then you muddy yourself. So
Right.
being super clear up front is super
Yeah.
super helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, just don't be
Wonderful.
scared. It's gonna be great.
There's a significant, I think, area of interest for all of us, me for sure, on data and matrix, okay, to be tracked.
Hmm.
And so I'm sure are you when you are tracking, CS operations, and now specific to the startup and the maturity curve a company goes through. And I know you and I have discussed this briefly before. Uh, what matrix do you start off with? Because you can boil the ocean with 2025 very easily, but it may not solve for what you are actually trying to achieve. Is it better to start off with a few? If yes, which few would you recommend starting off with?
Oh, completely. It's so much better to start off with a few. And that's, another one of the mistakes I did when early on in my CS career was like, okay, let me get all these metrics because of I have an understanding of everything that's going on to help me. And then I was boiling ocean. I was not focusing on anything. And that was not good. So I really recommend kind of startups starting with 3. And the 3 are, essentially following the customer journey map: adoption, engagement, and renewal. So what I mean by that is really understand, like, and it's not just like, oh, Jen says adoption, and therefore I should just put in adoption metrics. Like, no, figure out what adoption metric works best for you, right?
Correct.
So what, like, for example, I use Slack a lot. So maybe my first adoption metric is that they've logged into Slack, that they've created a Slack account. And make it super easy. Like, if you don't know where your bar is, like, choose one and then see where you're at. And then you can eventually graduate to the next one. So maybe in the Slack example, I see that, I started out with like 70% of everyone creating their account within the first 3 days or something. And now it's at 90%. Great. I feel pretty good about that. Let me then graduate my adoption metric to sending the first message, for example. And then maybe that'll be like, okay, now that's back to 70. And then I can work on that. So you're having like a maniacal focus on just like one adoption metric, and how do I get that to the next level? And the same thing goes for engagement. So like, when are they coming back? How are they remembering you throughout the cycle? And how are they are they using you post adoption, post implementation? Because if they're not, that's a different problem. And of course, you can't forget about renewals. But again, here is not trying to boil the ocean. It's not renewals, retention, churn, referrals, advocacy, all that stuff. No, just focus on one. And especially for startups, like, sometimes the renewals is too far ahead for you to even, really focus and
renewals
strategize.
Upfront. That's correct.
Yeah, think about that up front. So, for example, sometimes I do, try, like, how many trial churns do we have? Or how many people, what's our trial retention number? And I'm not even thinking of contract retention, because if my trial retention is, horrible, my actual retention is not going to be any better. And so, like, what is that first, like, milestone in which they have to show their commitment, whether that is they get that add-on that most people will probably get, or they get that, they maybe in the Slack example, early on, maybe it's, they got it, but maybe they got, their entire company on it, or they get their entire, like, more than 20 people on it, because that shows a commitment that they did to bring more to you. And so be creative when it comes to metrics, but I really think it should be just 3. So, adoption, engagement, and then renewals. That does not mean to not look at anything else. It just means, how do you focus your time, and how do you kind of like focus your energies when it comes to metrics?
Wonderful. I think very well said. So I'll ask you one more before we end this session. But and this is a head of CS question. So in your role, you are sort of the conduit through which the board matrix and the board initiatives actually get implemented through the team, right? So and that messaging goes through you, the KPIs goes through you. Has there been any learnings across the challenges? Because it's not very easy to one, address the board and the CXO layer in a certain way, and then when you trickle that down into actual operations and actual customers, ground reality is slightly different always. So you have to do that amplification or the transformer sort of job. But has there been any learnings for you there from a head of CS role? How do you actually balance out both sides?
Yeah, and I think it's really about, as you were saying, transforming, like, you're just translating, right? Like, how I might, message a KPI to my team is probably it's going to be different than how I message the exact same KPI, and how I tell that story around it, upwards, even, even quarterly, or, whatever that is. And just being really clear in that story. Like, of course, the stories are going to be very similar, but it's like, how do I tailor it to the audience? Of what do they care about? Why do they care about it? It's kind of similar to customer success. It's like internal customer success is like, what are their goals? Why are they interested in this metric? And how can I make sure I'm telling that story around it? So, if it's lower than expected or higher than expected, how do I, even manage expectations around it? How do I tell that story so that folks are all, in line? And I think for me, like that was one of my earlier mistakes, is that I would be like, well, this is our number, I'll just blast it to everyone without necessarily contextualizing and, providing the context that people needed. You know, when they receive that information, because you can confuse more people than help if you just blast it.
Yeah, agreed. No, great having you, Jennifer. I think you provided some wonderful insights. Hopefully the audience also likes it. We will be circulating this on all channels specifically. So thank you again for joining a Caffeine Carrot session with us. Always a pleasure talking to you. You have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks again for having me. It was so much fun.
No, great pleasure. Thank you.